You used to live like you owed everyone an explanation for simply existing. Remember those times when you'd catch yourself mid-sentence, already launching into a 3-paragraph justification for why you felt tired after a long week? Or how you'd practically write a dissertation in your head before declining a dinner invitation because you just wanted to stay home with takeout and Netflix? Every boundary you tried to set came wrapped in apologies and detailed reasoning, like you were defending yourself in some invisible courtroom where being human required legal documentation. Think about the last time someone asked why you seemed quiet at a family gathering. Instead of just saying, "I'm good," just listening, you probably found yourself explaining your entire emotional state, your work stress, maybe even apologizing for not being more entertaining. You wanted so desperately to be understood that you'd slice off pieces of your authentic self and serve them up, hoping someone would finally get you. But here's what nobody tells you. Every time you did that, something inside you cracked. Not dramatically, not loudly, but deep down where it really mattered. You didn't realize it then, but you were basically auctioning off your soul in bite-sized pieces, trying to buy something you already owned. The right to be yourself without a PowerPoint presentation explaining why. For the longest time, you thought staying quiet meant you were giving up. Like if you didn't defend every choice, every feeling, every moment of needing space, you'd somehow disappear completely. It's like being in a meeting where you feel pressure to speak up constantly, not because you have something valuable to add, but because silence feels like admitting defeat. You mistook being seen by others for being protected from losing yourself, but the irony is brutal. They never really saw you anyway. They only saw the carefully crafted version you presented, like watching a movie trailer and thinking you know the whole story. Remember how exhausting it was to maintain that performance? You'd rehearse, "I'm fine," in the mirror until it sounded convincing. You'd practice casual responses to intrusive questions about your dating life, your career choices, your decision to spend Saturday reorganizing your closet instead of going to that party everyone assumed you'd attend. The real you was buried under layers of explanations, justifications, and preemptive defenses against judgments that might not even come. But then something shifted. Maybe it started small, like the day you didn't explain why you ordered a salad instead of pizza at lunch with coworkers. Or when your mom asked why you seemed distant during your weekly phone call and you just said, "I'm processing some things," without launching into a detailed breakdown of your entire mental state. These tiny moments of not over-explaining felt almost rebellious, didn't they? People noticed the change, and honestly, it scared them a little. Not because you became mean or cold, but because you stopped being afraid of not being understood. It's like when you're at a restaurant and you order exactly what you want without polling the entire table about their opinions first. Some people don't know how to handle that kind of quiet confidence. You know what they say about women who fall silent being dangerous? It's not because we're plotting anyone's downfall. It's because we've finally stopped listening to everyone else's noise and started tuning into that steady voice inside that's been waiting patiently for us to pay attention. Think of it like finally turning off the car radio that's been playing static for years and realizing you can actually hear your own thoughts while driving. When you finally chose to listen to yourself instead of constantly managing other people's comfort levels, something amazing happened. The constant battle in your head started to quiet down, not because the outside world suddenly became peaceful. People still had opinions about your choices, still expected explanations for your boundaries, but because their demands stopped ruling your inner world. The more you stopped explaining yourself, the more you remembered who you actually were before you learned to twist yourself into pretzel shapes for approval. You remembered loving rainy Sunday mornings alone with a book, even if your friends couldn't understand why you'd choose that over brunch plans. You remembered having strong opinions about movies, even if they weren't popular opinions. You remembered that your sensitivity wasn't a character flaw that needed constant explanation. It was just part of how you experienced the world. Those years you spent justifying your softness, treating it like some kind of defect that needed a doctor's note. What a waste of energy. And all those relationships where you felt like you had to provide a thesis defense for why you deserved love and respect. That wasn't love at all. Real love doesn't require you to explain why you're worthy of it. When someone truly cares about you, they don't need a detailed breakdown of your emotional resume before deciding you're worth their time. You started to understand that you were never supposed to be easily digestible, like some kind of emotional fast food that anyone could consume without effort. You're more like a complex wine, rich, layered, and definitely not for everyone's taste, and that's perfectly fine. When you stopped offering subtitles for your existence, you didn't become cold or difficult. You became sovereign. You became the author of your own story instead of letting everyone else edit your chapters. There's this beautiful stillness now that speaks volumes more than any of your desperate explanations ever did. It's the kind of presence that doesn't knock on doors begging for entry. It simply exists, and people either recognize its value or they don't. In grocery stores, you no longer feel compelled to explain your cart full of frozen dinners to the checkout person. At work meetings, you don't preface every idea with 3 apologies. When someone asks why you're not dating anyone right now, you might just smile and change the subject instead of launching into a detailed analysis of modern romance. This transformation isn't about becoming a mystery for mystery's sake. It's about finally understanding that you don't need to belong to other people's vocabulary. You're not a word they get to define and redefine based on their limited understanding. You're an entire language, rich and complex, and frankly, not everyone deserves to be fluent in you. You're not vanishing into silence. You're remembering who you were before the world convinced you that being yourself required a permission slip. For years, you operated under this exhausting belief that being loved meant being completely transparent, like a house with all the curtains open and lights on 24/7. So, you handed people detailed blueprints of your heart, complete with highlighted sections marking all your vulnerable spots. "Here's where I bruise easily," you'd say. "Please don't step here. This is where I keep my childhood hurts." You'd soften every sharp edge about yourself until you were practically a marshmallow, thinking that if you were gentle enough, understanding enough, accessible enough, surely no one would want to leave. But they still missed you entirely. Not because you were too much, that's what you told yourself, but because you were working so hard not to be yourself that there wasn't much authentic left to see. You learned something painful, but necessary. Some people don't actually want to understand you. They want to categorize you, file you away in a mental folder labeled complicated woman or high maintenance or whatever other shorthand helps them avoid dealing with your full humanity. When you cried watching a commercial about a dog finding its way home, they called you emotional. When you needed space after a draining social event, they called you antisocial. These weren't observations about who you are. They were projections of their own discomfort, painted onto you like graffiti you didn't ask for. You wore those labels for so long, you started believing they were designer clothes instead of cheap disguises. But your growing comfort with silence began stripping away those false identities layer by layer. It was like taking off makeup you'd been wearing so long you forgot what your actual face looked like underneath. When you finally got quiet enough to really look at yourself, not through their eyes, but through that honest mirror inside you, you saw things you'd been avoiding. The anger you'd swallowed at family dinners when relatives made casual comments about your life choices. The loneliness you'd tried to cure by saying yes to every social invitation, even when you craved solitude. The way you disguised your own needs as caregiving, convincing yourself that anticipating everyone else's feelings was the same as being loving. It hurt to see all of this, like looking at old photos where you're clearly uncomfortable but trying to smile anyway. But it also freed something essential. You began to understand that you weren't broken, just buried under years of trying to be the version of yourself that made other people comfortable. Here's what no one teaches you about silence. It's not empty space waiting to be filled with explanations. It's honest. It reveals things. When you stop talking to fill awkward pauses, you start hearing what's actually happening in the room. When you stop explaining away your gut feelings, you start trusting them. When you stop narrating your every emotional state, you start experiencing your feelings without needing to justify them to an invisible audience. Yes, sometimes this feels like loneliness, like that moment when you realize you've been performing a one-person show for years and suddenly the theater is empty. But underneath that temporary ache is something more permanent and nourishing, the discovery of a home that was never outside you in the first place. You've learned to sit with silence now without immediately rushing to redecorate it with words. It's like learning to appreciate the space between musical notes, that pause that makes the melody meaningful. In those quiet moments, you reconnect with parts of yourself that have been waiting patiently for your attention. The woman who loves thunderstorms and doesn't need to explain why. The person who sometimes needs to leave parties early and doesn't owe anyone a medical excuse. The human being who has complex feelings about simple things and simple feelings about complex things. You're not here to be a walking explanation of yourself. You're not here to make your truth comfortable enough for others to digest without effort. You're not a rough draft waiting for someone else's editing. You are the final version, complete as you are, worthy of love without footnotes. Those who can't meet you in that deep, honest silence where real truth lives. They were never meant to be permanent residents in your life anyway. Their leaving isn't a wound you need to heal from. It's a clearing. Space opening up for the people who can appreciate you without requiring you to translate yourself into their limited emotional vocabulary. This is your beginning. Not the beginning of becoming someone new, but the beginning of finally meeting who you've always been underneath all those explanations. The beginning of no longer asking for permission to exist fully in your own skin. There's a particular strength that develops when you stop announcing your worth to every room you enter. It's quiet, understated, and absolutely unmistakable. You can see it in how you order coffee now. No lengthy explanation of why you want oat milk instead of regular, no preemptive apology for being difficult. You just ask for what you want and wait for them to make it. People feel this shift even when they can't name it. Your coworkers notice that you no longer volunteer detailed justifications for why you can't stay late on Friday. Your family realizes you've stopped defending your life choices during holiday dinners. You're not being rude or dismissive. You're just not participating in the exhausting game of having to earn your right to have preferences. This makes some people uncomfortable, and honestly, that tells you everything you need to know. They're unsettled by your refusal to hand over your vulnerability like currency in some twisted emotional economy. You're no longer giving receipts for your humanity, no longer auditioning for basic respect, and some folks don't know how to interact with someone who isn't performing their worth. You used to confuse keeping the peace with keeping yourself small. You thought accommodating everyone else's comfort meant you were being kind, but really you were just afraid of taking up space. Now you understand the difference between being passive and being at peace. Real peace doesn't require you to disappear. It asks you to show up authentically and let other people figure out how they want to respond to that. This is when you become truly dangerous, not in a harmful way, but in a way that shakes up false foundations. You become untouchable by manipulation because you're no longer afraid of disappointing people who were never really invested in your well-being anyway. You can't be flattered into betraying your own instincts or guilted into staying where your soul has outgrown the space. You're not explaining your grief anymore, not packaging your pain into neat little portions that others can handle without getting uncomfortable. You carry your experiences with dignity now, like wearing a piece of jewelry that has deep meaning, even if others can't see its value. You've stopped asking the world to validate your struggles and started blessing your own healing process. Sometimes you wonder if this makes you seem hard or cold to people who knew the old version of you. But you're not cold. You've just stopped burning yourself out trying to keep other people warm. You've learned the difference between being loving and being self-sacrificing, between being open and being defenseless. Your solitude isn't something that needs explaining or fixing. It's not a problem to solve or a phase to grow out of. It's sacred space where you remember who you are when nobody's watching, where you can hear your own thoughts without having to defend them to an imaginary jury. The more comfortable you become with your own company, the clearer it becomes that you were always enough. Not after achieving something, not after someone chooses you, not after proving your worth through endless explanations. Right now, exactly as you are. Let people call you distant or difficult if that helps them process their discomfort with someone who refuses to shrink. They're only naming what they can't control, and mirrors have never been popular with people who avoid looking at themselves too closely. You don't exist to be understood by everyone. You exist to be whole. And wholeness isn't always pretty or convenient or easy to digest. Sometimes it's messy, inconvenient, and absolutely non-negotiable. But it's yours, all of it, claimed without apology or explanation. You've stopped sitting in rooms where your authentic voice gets drowned out by politeness. You've walked away from conversations that required you to edit yourself in real time, not with dramatic exits or angry speeches, but with a quiet certainty that your energy is precious and you're done wasting it on people who can't handle your full humanity. They definitely noticed when you stopped softening your opinions to avoid seeming too much, when you let uncomfortable silences exist instead of rushing to fill them with self-deprecating humor, when you simply allowed your absence to communicate what you'd exhausted yourself trying to explain with words. You used to think being misunderstood was the worst thing that could happen to you. Now you know that being misused is infinitely worse. So you left doors open, but only for people willing to walk through them with genuine respect for what they'd find on the other side. You've discovered that clarity feels like cruelty to people who benefited from your confusion. Your boundaries feel like betrayal to those who got comfortable crossing them. But you don't flinch when they flinch anymore. You don't run back into situations that drain you just because someone labels your exit as cold or selfish. This isn't bitterness talking. Bitterness feeds on what's missing, but you're learning to nourish yourself with what's real. And what's real doesn't need costume jewelry or special lighting to be beautiful. It doesn't require perfect packaging or advanced marketing to be valuable. It just asks that you stay present to yourself, even when everyone else seems to have left the building. You're not afraid of being alone anymore because you finally understand the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is when you abandon yourself to avoid abandonment by others. Solitude is when you choose your own company because you've become someone worth spending time with. In this space, you've started having conversations with the parts of yourself that used to wait at the edges of your awareness, too scared to speak up. The little girl who learned that love had to be earned through perfect behavior. The teenager who thought being needed was the same as being wanted. The young woman who bent herself into silence because the truth would have made people uncomfortable. Now you let them all have their say, not to the world but to you. And in listening to these inner voices, you've developed something precious and rare: self-trust. Not the loud, aggressive kind that demands certainty about everything, but the quiet, steady kind that lets you walk into any situation without needing external validation to know you belong there. You used to be a translator, constantly converting your authentic thoughts and feelings into words that wouldn't threaten anyone's comfort zone. But you're no longer responsible for other people's emotional GPS systems. You've become your own compass, pointing toward what feels true rather than what feels safe. There are still moments when you ache to be deeply understood, still nights when the silence feels heavy instead of peaceful. But now you know how to hold that longing without letting it hollow you out from the inside. You understand that being truly seen starts with seeing yourself clearly, not in the funhouse mirror of other people's projections, but in the honest reflection of your own awareness. When you do speak now, it's not to convince anyone of anything. It's simply to be clear about where you stand. And sometimes you don't speak at all, because your silence has learned to say what your explanations never could. I'm not asking you to understand me. I'm asking myself to stay true. You used to believe that love meant enduring, staying in the room during fights, staying in relationships that felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small, staying present for pain that wasn't teaching you anything except how much you could tolerate. You confused endurance with devotion, thinking that love was measured by how much discomfort you could absorb without complaining. But now you see it differently. Love isn't proved by how long you can stay where you're not truly met or valued. It's revealed in how quickly you choose yourself when you start to disappear. You don't abandon ship at the first sign of rough weather, but you also don't go down with boats that were never seaworthy to begin with. You used to present your life choices like they were proposals needing board approval, as if your desire for peace required a committee review before you could act on it. But silence has taught you something revolutionary. Truth doesn't campaign for acceptance. It just exists, like gravity or photosynthesis or the way your heart beats without asking permission. Some people will say you've changed, and they're absolutely right, but not in the ways they fear. You haven't lost your capacity for empathy. You've just stopped pouring it into broken containers. You haven't become cold. You've become discerning. Your warmth is still there, but it's no longer available to people who mistake your kindness for weakness or your gentleness for gullibility. You don't build bridges to people who stand on the other side with matches anymore. You've learned to recognize the difference between someone who's genuinely trying to understand you and someone who just wants to file you under a category that makes them comfortable. You've watched people recoil from your honesty because they'd gotten so used to your carefully curated version. They thought your previous people-pleasing was your real personality, not a survival strategy you'd developed over years of learning that taking up space came with consequences. When you stopped performing that exhausting show, they felt confused, maybe even betrayed, as if you'd somehow been false advertising your entire personality. But you know the truth. Your silence isn't submission anymore. It's revolution. A quiet declaration that you no longer bleed for connection that costs you your authentic self. You breathe for truth now, and truth has its own rhythm that doesn't sync up with everyone else's expectations. You want love? Of course you do. But not the kind that requires you to fold yourself into origami shapes to fit someone else's idea of the perfect partner, friend, or family member. You want love that meets you where you actually are, not because you've managed to convince someone you're worthy through a complex presentation of your best qualities. You've stopped choosing people who require you to betray your own knowing. When your gut says someone isn't safe, you listen now instead of talking yourself out of that wisdom. You've stopped apologizing for having instincts that protect you from situations that look good on paper but feel wrong in your body. Most importantly, you've learned the difference between being chosen and being cherished. Being chosen can be about convenience, availability, or how well you fit into someone's existing life without requiring them to grow or change. Being cherished is about being valued for exactly who you are, not who you might become with enough coaching. Now you cherish yourself first, not through daily affirmations or forced positivity, but through the simple, consistent act of honoring what you know to be true about yourself, even when it's inconvenient. You close doors quietly instead of slamming them. You walk away from situations that require you to abandon yourself without making a big production about it. You're no longer waiting for someone else to make you feel real or valuable or worthy of care. You are real. You've always been real. The moment you stopped explaining yourself into existence was the moment you stepped fully into the truth that you were never supposed to be anyone else's project or proof of concept. You're not a mystery that needs solving or a puzzle missing pieces. You're a complete presence that some people have the wisdom to appreciate and others, frankly, don't. And that's not your problem to fix anymore. Only the people who carry that same reverence for authentic connection will earn the privilege of staying in your inner circle. Everyone else gets your kindness, your professionalism, your basic human decency, but they don't get your soul. That's not for sale anymore.